Okay, everyone, thank you for being here for this last seminar of the term. Before I introduce our speaker of today, just two announcements. The first one is just the next two talks that we will have next term on the 5th of May. It is Marilyn Hembury Tennyson from the Thousand Year Trust. The title is still to be confirmed. And on Friday, the 8th of May, with David Abraham, and he's going to be talking about between the human, animal, and the animate earth. And the second announcement, as you know, after the talk, we always have some drinks and snacks in the diversity room around the corner, just to have a chat with the speaker if you want. I'll now just introduce our speaker of today is Professor Dominick Spracklen, who is a professor of biosphere-atmosphere interactions at the University of Leeds. His research focuses on understanding how land use change, particularly tropical deforestation, influences climate, air quality, and human health. He uses a combination of observations and earth system modeling, and his works has helped quantify the impacts of forest on rainfall, temperature, fire, and public health across the tropics. Thank you. Thank you for being here, Dominick.
Yeah.
The floor is yours.
Thank you for that introduction. So we know tropical forests store and sequester carbon dioxide, and that's an important way in which tropical forests help in the fight against climate change. And in fact, a lot of the protection of tropical forests recently has been built around the ability of tropical forests to store carbon. But do tropical forests provide a much more immediate benefit for climate and for public health? And does tropical deforestation have immediate impacts on climate and public health? And could understanding those better provide a broader consensus for tropical forest protection? And that's what my talk is going to be about today. So anyone that's worked in tropical forests will know that some of the benefits that those forests provide for local climate, it's often feels cooler and maybe moister and wetter and damper within a tropical forest than in outside a tropical forest and in deforested regions. And as always, if you talk to local communities and local people that live near tropical forests, they often recognize those benefits. And so this was a really nice study that talked to people living in and around protected tropical forests in Southeast Asia, and asked those people what were the benefits that they felt those forests brought to them. And so this graph on the left shows some of those benefits that the people talked about. And so they mentioned things like the forest provided clean air, they provided clean water, they provided reliable rainfall, and they helped cool the climate. And so over the last 5 to 10 years, my research group in Leeds has been trying to provide stronger evidence, scientific evidence, to quantify some of these benefits. And hopefully by providing that stronger evidence, we can provide stronger support for the protection of tropical forests. So one of those described benefits of forests is that the forests help provide a reliable source of rainfall. And in fact, this has been an issue which has interested humanity for hundreds of years. You can read back to ancient Romans and ancient Greeks talking about the connection between forests and rainfall. And it's something that's interested scientists for over 140 years. This is a paper that appeared in the journal Science in 1888, entitled "Do Forests Influence Rainfall?" I think it's really interesting that we're still talking about the same question over 100 years later. But we know a lot more now than we did then about the mechanisms through which tropical forests do impact climate and could impact rainfall. And these are kind of shown in this schematic here. One of the most obvious ones is the way that trees and forests pump water into the atmosphere through a process called evapotranspiration. So trees take water from the roots up through their trunks and emit that into the atmosphere. And the energy that it takes to evaporate that moisture changes the balance of something called sensible heat and latent heat above the canopy. And so because it takes energy to evaporate the moisture, to evaporate that water, there's less energy available to heat the local atmosphere. So you can kind of think that a little bit like your body sweating on a hot day, that the evaporation of that sweat is what cools your body. And sort of that same mechanism is happening above forests, but on a much bigger scale. So that evaporation of moisture into the atmosphere takes vast amounts of energy, and that transfer of energy to evaporate the moisture reduces the amount of energy that's available to heat the atmosphere. There's a number of other mechanisms that forests have that can impact local climate. Another important one is the albedo of the surface, the albedo of the forest. Forests tend to be slightly darker than grasslands or pasture. It's because they're darker, they tend to absorb slightly more radiation from the sun. And that has the opposite effect, that it will make that surface slightly warmer than a grassland or pasture. And also, obviously, forests have much thicker and deeper canopies than grasslands or pasture. And that can also impact the flow of air over the surface and changes the exchange of momentum between the surface and the atmosphere. And so it's not immediately apparent what the impacts of forests will be on even local temperature or local rainfall, because there's a kind of quite complex different mix of different mechanisms going on. And these mechanisms kind of span from the local, almost microclimate scale, so immediately above a forest or immediately above a deforested surface, out into 1 or 10 or kilometers away from a forest, potentially even out to continental scales by altering patterns of air movement across a continent. So kind of understanding these, we have to think about scales that go from tens of meters to kilometers out to a continental scale. So one big advantage we have compared to scientists who were thinking about this in 1888 is we have much better measurements now of the fluxes of water and energy between the surface and the atmosphere. And this is a really cool observational facility right in the center of the Amazon. It's called ATO. It's called the Amazon Tall Tower Observatory. So this is about 50 to 100 kilometers north of Manaus, so right in the center of the Amazon forest. And this tower here is over 300 meters high. It's actually higher than the Eiffel Tower. And all the way up this tower is measurements of climate and measurements of fluxes of moisture and energy between the surface and the atmosphere. And you can see the sort of amazing view that you get if you climb up this tower. It takes about, well, it took me about 45 minutes to climb from the bottom to the top. That's not the quickest it's been done. But at the top here, you get an absolutely incredible view across the Amazon forest. What towers like this enable us to do is to measure that evapotranspiration flux between the forest and the atmosphere. And that's what's shown on this graph here. This is the seasonal cycle of that moisture flux into the atmosphere, measured at a range of different towers like that across the Amazon. So these towers are not quite as tall as that, but very similar otherwise. And so what this is comparing here is a kind of forest surface, which is shown in green. This is the amount of moisture that forest puts into the atmosphere, compared to a pasture surface, so a deforested surface in orange here. And you can see that through most of the year, and particularly during the drier periods, the forest is pumping more moisture into the atmosphere than the pasture. And this difference here is going to lead to some of those impacts on climate that we're interested in. Another really important difference we have compared to people that were studying this 140 years ago is satellite data that provides really detailed information of climate across our planet. This is a satellite that's part of the Global Precipitation Measurement Mission. And these satellites give snapshots of rainfall that's occurring right across the globe. That's what's shown in these plots here. And this is showing the rainfall that's measured on this satellite in the last 24 hours across the Amazon. So this is from yesterday, the accumulated rainfall across the last 24-hour period. As you can see, that's the nice patterns of storms that are happening across the Amazon. And so what we can use this data to look at is, do we see different patterns of rainfall over forested regions compared to unforested regions, or do we see different patterns of rainfall over deforested regions compared to forest regions? And so this kind of cartoon here shows the kind of approach that we do. It's very simple. We use a satellite to look at which areas of the tropics have lost their forest cover, which areas have been deforested. And then we use that satellite measuring rainfall to look at that change in rainfall over the same period. And then we can compare what's the change in rainfall over areas that have kept their forest cover compared to areas that have lost their forest cover, that have been deforested. And from that difference, we can look at what has been the impact of deforestation in the last few decades on climate across the tropics. So that's what we see in this plot here. This is showing the change in rainfall on the y-axis at different scales here, going from a few kilometers, this is a 5-kilometer scale, up to a 200-kilometer scale here. And this is that observed change in rainfall that the satellite sees in these deforested regions compared to nearby forest. And so we can see that particularly as the scale gets above about 50 kilometers in scale, those deforested regions are having less rainfall than nearby forest regions. So I think this gives, maybe for the first time, that observational evidence from satellite that deforestation is causing a reduction in rainfall. So I think gives that kind of observational proof that forests are enhancing rainfall at these local scales. And we looked across different seasons, and we saw the same effect or similar direction of effect in the wet season and the dry season. And the sort of magnitude of effect we see is that deforestation in the tropics drives around a 10 to 15% reduction in local rainfall. So that kind of gives you a kind of sense of scale. So that was sort of what's the impact of deforestation on, or impact of forests on local rainfall, but do forests also impact downwind rainfall at bigger scales? And so to look at this question, we combined information from satellite of where forests are around the tropics. And we used a model which is called an atmospheric back trajectory model, which can track the movement of air around the planet. So it's sort of looking at how air moves across a continent. And so kind of you can see here different examples of these air kind of parcels coming into a location in the Amazon. So each one of these lines shows the direction that air has traveled over the past few days to reach this location. So it's kind of traveled over the ocean here, reached the South American continent, and then traveled across the continent to this location. So we can kind of combine these two data sets together to give a map of what we've called exposure to forest cover. So how much forest air masses have passed over the past few days. So you can see this looks a little bit different to this forest cover map, because we've got areas in sort of southern Brazil, for instance, down here, that haven't got much forest cover in that location, but air masses that have traveled to this location have passed right across the Amazon, so have traveled over a lot of forest to reach there. So then we combined this information on exposure to forest cover with information on rainfall to answer the question, if air travels over more forest, does it produce more or less rainfall? And so what we find is that air masses that have traveled over more forest in the preceding few days produce at least twice as much rainfall as air masses that have passed over little vegetation. So again, this is in the observations, sort of showing that we can see this evidence that forests are enhancing rainfall at these regional scales. So this was work that we did quite a few years ago now. But much more recently, we've been interested in, can we see evidence that deforestation has impacted rainfall downwind? So if you're somewhere in the tropics, or if you're in southern Brazil, let's say in Sao Paulo, is there any evidence that rainfall there has been impacted by deforestation happening hundreds or thousands of kilometers away in the Amazon? And we think there is. So this is a paper that we just published a few weeks ago. The top two plots here show the pattern of rainfall, the rainfall trend over this region over the last few decades. And this is in two different rainfall datasets. We see a reduction in rainfall in the southern Amazon. We think this is linked to that exposure to upwind deforestation. So those air masses are passing over deforested land. They're gaining less moisture from the forest, and this is driving this reduction in rainfall in this region. So in a kind of related analysis, we're looking at this in a bit more depth. And so here on the left now, we've got the top left, we've got the pattern of deforestation that's happened across the tropics in the last few decades. And so you see this sort of maybe well-known pattern of deforestation over the tropics. So you can see the arc of deforestation in the Amazon. You can see deforestation has happened in the Congo and also in Southeast Asia. So this is deforestation that's observed by satellite over the past few decades. And then we've used the same method using this air parcel method to look at where air has been exposed has passed over that deforestation. And that's what's shown here on the right. So you can see, we know the air is coming in off the ocean here, traveling across the Amazon, traveling over that deforestation and traveling into the south of Brazil. So you can see right across southern parts of Brazil, air masses that are arriving there have traveled over regions of deforestation in the southern Amazon. And you can see similar patterns in the Congo and Southeast Asia. So then we looked at what was the trend in that exposure to forest loss over that 20-year period. So this plot here is showing places that are being increasingly exposed to deforested air masses over that 20-year period. So you can see particularly in the Amazon and downwind of the Amazon, air masses are traveling increasingly over deforested land over the last few decades. And then we looked at the trend in rainfall over the same period. So it's the change in rainfall over the 20-year period. So here, these red areas showing where there's been reductions in rainfall over that 20-year period. And so then in a similar analysis to what we did before, we looked at, is there any evidence that areas that have seen more increasing exposure to deforested land, are those areas receiving more or less rainfall? And we see real evidence that as air masses are exposed to more deforestation, so that's going up to the right on this x-axis, they're in general more likely to have negative trends in rainfall over the period. So at the far right of this plot, these are places that air has traveled over more and more deforested land over the last few decades, and they're likely to be places that have dried, have received less rainfall over that period. And we see consistent patterns in the dry season and the wet season. And so we then compare places that have seen relatively little change in exposure to deforested land to areas that have seen large changes. So comparing the kind of two extremes of this distribution. And that's what we see here. So here, this is comparing, the blue is places that haven't seen much more exposure to deforestation compared to red, places that have. And we see consistently across scales, across across the Amazon, those places that have been experienced more exposure to deforestation consistently have stronger reductions in rainfall over this period. And we can see here the kind of scale that we see this at. You can see this happens at a local scale but we also see the effect thousands of kilometers downwind. So this is showing that places, hundreds to thousands of kilometers downwind of that deforestation in the Amazon are being impacted and having reduced rainfall due to that effect. So all of that was in observations. What about climate models? How do climate models simulate the same thing? And so this, again, is a paper that we wrote over 10 years ago, where we collected together all the different climate model simulations of Amazon deforestation and what they said about the impacts on precipitation. And that's what's shown on this plot here. For different levels of deforestation in the Amazon, what was the impact on rainfall? And you see really big variability and uncertainty in those models. So a big range from some models that predict that deforestation will increase rainfall to some models predicting a very strong reduction in rainfall, so almost 60% reduction in rainfall. The multi-model mean, so if you just take the average across all the models, is a reduction of about 12%. So a very large uncertainty and variability across those models. But these are quite old climate models. So what do we get if we look at much newer models? So this is now looking at the latest generation of climate models that submitted to the last IPCC assessment. And we see that uncertainty persists in these latest models. So of the 11 different models that submitted to this experiment, 6 models predict that deforestation of the Amazon reduces rainfall, and 5 models predict it increases rainfall. And the multi-model mean is a reduction, but the uncertainty is quite large. So obviously this is not really maybe very useful information to give a policymaker if you're saying from these projections you can't really predict whether deforestation is going to increase or reduce rainfall. So we were interested in trying to understand a bit more about what was behind this variability across the models. So to do that, we looked into the water budget across the different models. The kind of schematic of that is shown here. So the two things that we've talked about already, so we've got precipitation, obviously. We've got that evapotranspiration, so that moisture coming from the forests into the atmosphere. But the other important component of the atmospheric moisture budget is something called moisture flux convergence. So that's the amount of moisture coming from outside the region into the Amazon. And the sum of these different terms add up. So we looked across all the different models, what were the differences in these different terms. And so this is what we saw before. 6 out of 11 models predict that deforestation reduces rainfall. We find very consistent that most of the models predict deforestation reduces evapotranspiration. That's what you'd expect. But we find this big uncertainty is what do the models predict is happening to that moisture flux convergence due to deforestation. And so why is that important? And so hopefully this next slide kind of explains this a bit. So we kind of know that deforestation is likely to reduce that moisture flux to the atmosphere, but what's the atmospheric response to that? So we find that in some models, this evapotranspiration reduces, but then these models predict that moisture flux convergence, that pull of moisture from outside into the Amazon increases. And we find that offsets some of this reduction in ET. And so the overall effect in these models is either a small reduction or a small increase in rainfall. But if the opposite happens, that evapotranspiration goes down, that then reduces the amount of moisture coming into the region, then these two terms combine, and then we get a much stronger reduction in rainfall. And so we think it's this difference, whether the models go this way or this way, that's driving that uncertainty in the models about the overall rainfall response. So what we did then was compare the models against the satellite observations. And so if you just take the multi-model mean, this is what we get here, and this is the observations. They sort of tend to underestimate the sensitivity of rainfall to deforestation. If we look at the models which have that positive response of moisture flux convergence, they tend to predict precipitation goes up in response to deforestation, and that doesn't seem to match the observations. But if we look at the models that predict a reduction in moisture flux convergence, they seem to match those models much more closely, match the observations much more closely. So we think, and we're looking at doing some other evidence to kind of pin this down a bit more, that these models are the ones that are well simulating the response of the atmosphere and precipitation to the deforestation. And so what we did was combined this information from this set of models here, plus the observations together, to try to kind of give a sort of new estimate of the rainfall generation service of tropical forests. And so what we find is that each hectare of tropical forest produces about 2.4 million litres of rainfall each year. That's enough to fill an Olympic swimming pool every year. It kind of gives you the sense of the scale of that rainfall generating service. And then we use some sort of simple economic estimations to kind of put a monetary value on that. And so that is worth, in terms of the rainfall generation service for Brazil's agriculture sector, each hectare of tropical forest is worth just short of $60 per hectare per year. And across the Amazon, that would put the Brazilian legal Amazon providing rainfall generation services about $20 billion per year. So we're hoping that some of these better quantification of that rainfall generating service and some simple estimates of the economic value of that can start to help policymakers understand the kind of value that standing tropical forests are providing to agriculture and the economy of big regions like Brazil. So now I'd like to kind of swap from thinking about rainfall to thinking about temperature. And what are the impacts of forests and what are the impacts of deforestation on local temperatures? And these are in fact really easy to see from space. And so what we see here is the observed deforestation pattern across tropics over the last 20 years. So it's the pattern we saw before. So again, you see the arc of deforestation in the Amazon and the well-known patterns in the Congo in Southeast Asia. And then if you look at the changes in surface temperature, again observed by satellite over the same period, you can see a really strong match between areas that have lost their forest or areas that have warmed quite strongly over that period. I mean, this is actually quite well known. There's been quite a lot of papers over the last 10 to 20 years that have shown this. But what we were interested in was what's the exposure of local populations of people living in and near these deforested regions to that temperature response due to deforestation. So on the left here is just showing the warming that's caused by deforestation across these different regions. But then we looked at what's the population weighted warming across those regions. So where are people living in and near these deforested regions, and what's their exposure to that heat from the deforestation? We found that over 300 million people living across the tropics are being exposed to warming due to that deforestation. So this is in addition to the kind of global climate change signal. It's just due to that deforestation. And then we used equations from the epidemiological literature of the kind of heat stress impacts of that exposure to heat to estimate that deforestation is causing in these regions about 28,000 additional premature mortalities each year due to that exposure to heat from deforestation. And in these regions, that's about 40% of the total heat stress mortality in those regions is due to deforestation rather than due to global climate change. So showing that deforestation is really having, a really serious and immediate impact on public health for people living in and near tropical forest regions. So to try and sort of provide that information, hopefully more easily to local communities and to the local governments that are in these regions, we've produced this sort of little tool here, which sits on the Met Office Viewpoint website, where you can use this to look at each individual region across the tropics, each administration area, what's the warming in that region due to local deforestation. So yeah, this is available here. And we're hoping providing this information is going to provide you a better understanding of the local impacts of deforestation on local climate and human health. But deforestation also causes, similar to impacts on rainfall, causing impacts on regional rainfall, we can show that deforestation also causes regional impacts on temperature as well. And so this is looking across the Amazon. This is looking at the warming due to that you experience above an area of deforestation. So if an area is deforested, what's the local warming that you experience? And that's what we've kind of seen in the previous few slides. But then we looked at, if we compare what's the warming you experience if you just have that local deforestation, how does it compare if you also have deforestation happening within the 10-kilometer regions of where you are? And you can see we have a stronger effect. And if we have deforestation occurring out to the 100-kilometer scale, you can see this effect is even more magnified. So here we can see observational evidence that deforestation is not only just warming locally, but that signal is spreading out outside that deforested region to within tens to hundreds of kilometers away. And here we split apart those different effects, here showing that local warming that we've quantified before, but here looking at the regional warming at the 10 to 100 kilometer scale. So I think this is showing this observational evidence that the warming signal is spreading way beyond the area of deforestation. So finally, we wanted to kind of go back to climate models to see whether we could look at this different responses between that local warming and the regional warming, and whether we can kind of quantify the impacts of that a bit better. So in a climate model, to do that, we use something known as checkerboard deforestation simulations. And so that's shown here on the left. This is showing the land surface within a climate model where we deforest in a checkerboard fashion across the Amazon. So we have alternate grid points where we deforest one grid point, then we don't deforest the next one, then we deforest the one after. And by doing that kind of strange pattern across the Amazon, we can unpick the local and regional responses of deforestation, because we can look directly over a place that's been deforested, we can look at the climate signal there, and then we can look at a grid point that's not had any deforestation, which is just experiencing that regional signal. And so from those two different effects, we can untangle the different processes going on. And that's kind of what's shown on the right here, is showing this is the total warming that you see in these experiments, and then unpicking that into a local signal. So what's the warming due to deforestation in that location? And then what's the non-local or regional signal? So then we can combine that information with future land use scenarios for the Amazon. And that's what's shown here, different deforestation scenarios for between now and 2050. And then we use two different climate models. We use the UK climate model, the UK ESM, and then we use the Brazilian climate model, BAM. Through combining the land use change information into these models, we were able to calculate the local and non-local warming in those different simulations. And what you can see here is in the climate models, we get sort of equivalent local warming of about 0.4 degrees centigrade due to that local warming, and equivalent warming at the regional scale. But maybe what's kind of really interesting is you can see that path, the local warming is obviously over the regions of deforestation, but that non-local warming spreads far downwind of the areas of deforestation, so right down into areas of southern Brazil. And in the Brazilian model is even more extensive, so right across regions of South America are experiencing warming due to that deforestation in the Amazon. So that's really important, because that means if you're living in Sao Paulo or Rio de Janeiro, part of the warming signal that you're experiencing, part of that climate warming you're experiencing, is due to Amazon deforestation that's happening hundreds or thousands of kilometers from where you live. And I think that's still not really well appreciated or understood by people, the importance of maintaining the tropical forests in the Amazon for the climate of cities hundreds or thousands of kilometers away from where that deforestation is happening. So we combined information from those simulations to estimate what were the different impacts on human health, on the left here, on cattle heat stress, so very important for Brazil, of course, for impacts on fire and also impacts on soybean agriculture. And you can see some of the numbers we estimate here from these climate models. So, for example, up to 8,000 premature mortalities occurring each year across South America due to the heat stress caused by this deforestation. About half of cattle across South America being exposed to heat warming due to that deforestation.
So what levels of deforestation?
Yeah, good question. So these are the different simulations we ran here. So these are projections for 2050 deforestation under these different SSP scenarios. So, but maybe these numbers are less important, or we were less interested in these numbers. They are important, of course, but what we were really interested in is what was the split between the local impact, so people living near the tropical forest deforestation regions, they might expect it to be impacted by that deforestation, versus people living away from it. We found that 85% of the human health signal was due to that non-local warming, so people living in regions away from that tropical deforestation. And so I think this is really important because it shows that it's not just people living near or in places of tropical deforestation that are experiencing those environmental impacts, but people living hundreds or thousands of kilometers away. So hopefully this schematic is almost my last slide, and hopefully kind of summarizes some of the effects that we've used observations and climate models to show. So I think we can show that within tropical forests, it's about 2 degrees cooler than nearby deforested regions. And that's a local effect, but it also spreads tens to hundreds of kilometers away from the region of deforestation. We think tropical forests provide about 300 millimeters extra rainfall each year. You lose that as you deforest. Again, that's an effect that happens locally, but also spreads hundreds to thousands of kilometers downwind. I like this statistic here. So the water that each large tropical tree pumps into the atmosphere, that cooling effect, you can think of about 3 air conditioners running continuously all the time. And that's a service that tree is kind of providing for humanity continuously, but is lost if we lose that tree. And we think that these impacts on temperature and rainfall are having some really immediate impacts on human health through increased heat stress, and the impacts on rainfall can have really important impacts on local and regional agriculture. And so we hope that providing more evidence of the kind of benefits that tropical forests provide at these local to regional scales can help build stronger and wider support for tropical forest protection, particularly in tropical forest nations, by demonstrating the value that those tropical forests provide locally. And hopefully, providing that evidence could also help to reduce tensions between tropical forest protection and agriculture by demonstrating the benefits that tropical forests are providing to nearby agricultural regions. So with this, I'd like to thank a wide range of people in Leeds. There are lots of other people that have contributed to this work. Some of this in this audience, embarrassingly, I haven't acknowledged in the slide. And also thanks to our funders here as well. So yeah, and thank you very much for your attention. I'm happy to take any questions.
Okay, We're going to open the floor for questions, and just to start with some of them, Dominic, thank you very much for this fantastic talk. You touch upon several fantastic points in here, from nature also to society, right? And just one first question. So you have showed the evidence of what happens basically with deforestation, regarding temperature and precipitation. But do you have also evidence of what happens with reforestation in some of these locations at big scale?
Yeah, so we haven't focused on that at all. So I should say Jess Baker, who's one of the contributors to this work, has just got a Future Leaders Fellowship. And that's sort of the focus of her fellowship, is to look at what are the benefits of reforestation, but also secondary forestry regrowth. Do you see cooling? Do you see increases in precipitation? So in our work, we haven't looked at that at all yet.
All right.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, excellent presentation. If evapotranspiration is essentially pulling water out from the rainforest and then distributing it eastward, if there is deforestation, do we see any evidence of increased local flooding and kind of lower water resilience because of the deforestation? Like, is there kind of a correlated other direction of kind of, because water's not being taken out of the region, but it's still landing there from upstream? Like, do we see any evidence that we're just kind of reducing water resilience locally as well? It stands to reason, but I'm just wondering if it can be measured.
Yeah, so yeah, again, we look at flooding. There is a lot of work that's looked at flooding and also water balance within rivers. I think part of our work shows a little bit more complex than might be thought of from a kind of hydrological sense, where you're just thinking about precipitation and evapotranspiration, because you're not thinking about how a forest driving wider atmospheric circulation and driving pull-in of moisture into the atmosphere. And so that can make things a little bit more complex than you might think from just thinking of evapotranspiration as a loss of moisture from the system.
Yes, hi. You mentioned work on looking at reforestation. Is there any plan to research specifically agroforestry and or even more specifically silvopasture? And when I see 50% of the cattle being subjected to heat stress, is quite a persuasive argument if you have data on silvopasture.
So we've not looked at that. There are papers that are showing that agroforestry and silvopasture do drive local cooling effects that are important for improving cattle health and for crop resilience as well. So I think there is work on that. I mean, I guess it's a related question to your question about reforestation. So I think in a basic way, you would think that reforesting would have the opposite effect to deforestation. It is going to be more complex than that, because as forestry grow, you're not replacing the kind of mature tropical forests that you had before. The kind of young trees are going to be fast growing, they're going to be shorter, they've got shallower roots. So there are going to be quite a lot of complexities about how quickly do you get those kind of climate services back when you reforest, that I think we don't yet know the answer to.
Hello. Hi. Thank you. I was just wondering about the relative contribution of roads and road networks to heat, specifically, and maybe even rainfall. Just roads tend to lead to deforestation. They tend to work together. And I wonder if you have any kind of data or information that allows you to separate out the various influences.
Yeah, so I mean, I think roads are going to be, people have shown, a real massive driver of deforestation in a lot of regions, and putting roads into an area is the kind of first step of causing that deforestation. So I think a lot of the deforestation patterns that we've been looking at here, roads are kind of an initial driver of that. I think actually the road itself won't be a strong impact of of heating compared to deforestation, just because it's such a much smaller footprint in the landscape. I mean, kind of the urban heat island, I guess, is maybe a better known kind of similar effect, which can have very big effects and does have very big effects for people living in cities. And that's kind of I guess, similar to what maybe you were thinking about. So yeah, in urban areas, I think definitely it's a very strong effect, but less so in rural regions.
I was wondering how much sort of work has been done on the way in which these effects from evapotranspiration of deforestation interact with effects on aerosol production, especially how aerosols from trees, so volatile organic compounds, interact with salt components from fungi, especially because I believe you used to work on fungal effects as well. So yeah, if you could just talk about that.
Yes, I haven't talked about that at all. I did used to work on it a lot. I think that there's probably big complexities there with aerosols that are maybe important. So trees emit biogenic gases and also biological particles to the atmosphere that can increase the amount of aerosols in the atmosphere, and aerosols are needed for cloud formation and for rainfall. So you'd think really when you deforest a region, you might reduce the amount of aerosol in the atmosphere. But actually you always see the opposite, because when you deforest, people move in, there's industry, there's cars, there's roads, there's dust. And so in general, you have clean, low aerosol over forests. And when you deforest, you end up having more aerosol. So it kind of gets very complicated, I think, because of that kind of balance between natural sources from the forest to man-made sources as well. But I think another very important part is the kind of connection between fire and deforestation. So in a lot of regions of the tropics, a lot of forests are cleared by people burning the forest, so slash and burn. So they cut the trees down and then they burn them. And we know that when there's a lot of smoke in the atmosphere, really large amounts of smoke, that can suppress precipitation. So we haven't looked at that here, but there probably is a sort of magnifying effect of the smoke from deforestation fires driving reductions in rainfall as well, that might either be additional to this or kind of part of the signal that we're seeing. And that's something we would like to look at, is that kind of how the kind of aerosol smoke and water budget kind of signals combine.
Okay. Would you say that this model is specifically applicable to tropical rainforest, or could this also be applied to maybe other kinds of environments, such as like a temperate rainforest? Is the tree biology too different between the two to have some crossover, or is there some kind of sort of fellowship between the two where you could use this model in other scenarios?
Yeah. So yeah, really good question that I didn't talk about at all. So there have been other papers that have shown similar effect in Europe. So again, from satellite data, you can see across the European continent, you can see this effect of downwind of forests within Europe, this effect of the forest pumping that moisture and recycling into the atmosphere. So I think it's definitely not just a tropical signal. I mean, here in the UK, most of our air masses come from the west, from the moisture-laden Atlantic. So I think we're kind of probably less exposed to it here than other regions, more continental regions in Europe. But I think it is kind of a much broader phenomenon.
Thank you. I think you said that you'd found about half the climate models were getting this process completely wrong, like finding the opposite of what was actually going on. How's that gone down with the climate modeling community? Do they agree? I mean,
I guess this is a bit of a kind of niche question for climate models. In some ways, that's not the main thing that they're doing. They're simulating, the impacts of global climate change, of increased CO2. And we're kind of looking here over the Amazon to quite a tough problem for those models to capture. So I wouldn't say what we're showing here, the models are getting that wrong, are, you know, they're wrong for this particular question and this particular issue over the Amazon. I don't think it makes any judgment on the kind of ability of that model to do, you know, wider projections for climate change. So that hasn't been a kind of massive, you know, outcry from the climate model community because of that. But I think here we've kind of got an observational constraint on that particular process in these models to say that, you know, those models are getting that wrong for some reason. We are looking into a bit more. There could be lots of potential reasons for that. It could be, you know, a process within the model, or it could be kind of the way the models are simulating changes in the land surface, that the kind of albedo change that they impose due to deforestation could be slightly off. So it might not be a kind of mechanistic problem with the model. It might be more the inputs that the model are taking.
I'm just going to ask a question from online, if that's okay, from Victoria McNamara. And she asks, is there evidence from your work to show if larger continuous areas of land remaining forested have greater benefits than smaller areas? And if so, can you suggest at what scale?
So I think for warming, we definitely see bigger impacts of kind of larger deforested regions have that stronger warming impact than small areas of deforestation. We've not looked at those impacts or kind of complexities in the impacts on rainfall, so I couldn't really answer that. But yeah, I think it will be an important thing to look at.
So just one more question about your thoughts about the scaling. How does these temperature and precipitation patterns, given these impacts of deforestation, scale with each other? So what is the expectation? So you talk a bit how it expands in space. So you get the impact from a few kilometers to hundreds of them. But what is the change that you see in temperature and precipitation at the same time for the same locations?
Yeah, I'm trying to think how to answer that. I think, yeah, sorry, maybe explain.
It's always that, for instance, in these deforested areas, you get, after a while, increases, perhaps of 0.5 to 1 or 2 Celsius degrees in temperature. First, what is the lack of this impact? When does it happen? What you have seen it happens? And what is kind of what you have seen that, or you expect to happen with the precipitation patterns? How much is the decrease? And does this kind of go pair in pair? And does this kind of pattern happens all over the place in any deforestation case that you have seen in the Amazon?
Yeah. Okay. So I guess the kind of, in terms of how quickly the kind of temporal impact of that, it's almost immediate in terms of that if you deforest a region, you know, instantly those moisture fluxes are changed. So that warming pattern happens very immediately. That impact on rainfall will happen, you know, almost immediately. I think in terms of the scales, it's much easier to detect that warming signal. That's, I think, more tightly tied to the deforestation, and the rainfall signal is kind of more diffusive. So I think there are kind of those different scales that are happening spatially as well. But I think in terms of temporally when they happen, they're kind of immediate after deforestation.
Thank you. I was steeped in this about 35 years ago when things were a bit more clunky. And the question that was forever being asked is how much internal circulation, how much rainfall is derived from within the forest itself. And we could never answer that. And I think perhaps the models have developed in that area because we had nothing, the models were very vertical. What we called, there's no advection and we felt that was very important for local effects and local communities. Is there any advance in that scale? Was your 50 kilometers?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I missed that a bit.
Yeah.
If you could expand on that, would be.
Yeah. So I guess, yeah. So yeah, definitely things have developed in terms of kind of computational complexity. So a lot of the climate models now are run at sort of a 50 to 100 kilometer-ish sort of scale, maybe 100 kilometers. And so you can get that kind of regional information across.
Yeah, Britain was sea when I was.
Yeah, so Britain is still like a kind of tough island to simulate. But yeah, you can use those models to calculate that kind of internal recycling versus what's coming in from outside.
And that's included.
And that's included.
Yeah.
And in parts of the Amazon, it's about 40 to 50% of the rainfall is kind of recycled moisture, and the rest is sort of oceanic. And in some parts of, if you look across, places that are really far from the ocean, like the Rio de Plata Basin in Brazil, it can get to sort of 70 to 80% in some regions.
Thanks. Thanks, a great talk. And so you said that the changes to the effect on the climate models is not that great,
Yeah.
but still, to what extent would this change the conclusions of, from the last IPCC, and to what extent will this hopefully be reflected in AR7? And then just specifically, I should know this perhaps, but you gave a figure for the value for this effect. I think, was it from the Amazon or for all tropical forests? But how does that compare with other values like the carbon effect of the carbon sequestration or the carbon loss from deforestation?
Yeah. So I think that is definitely both. I think the models are getting better, but I think also the kind of realism of land use change in models is getting better with each IPCC assessment. And I think the 7th assessment that'll improve further. And so I think hopefully what this work is showing is that land use change signal in the tropics is important, and so getting it right is important, and getting the process right and the model is important. So hopefully that's where this work can kind of inform, I guess, the climate model community on the kind of importance of these land use signals, which have maybe until more recently been kind of maybe thought of as not too important. In terms of the value that we estimated for the Brazilian Amazon was about $50 to $60 per hectare per year. So I think that would be depending on the value you put on carbon, of course. So if you calculated, the net present value of that would be maybe equivalent to the value that you'd put on carbon. So maybe it's sort of a.
So we're doubling the value, roughly.
Yeah.
And still, we can't raise money for the funds.
Yeah.
But yeah. Okay.
Thank you for the talk. I know you focus mainly on the Amazon, but like also other parts of the tropical forest. I was wondering, this is mainly on how climate or precipitation and temperature is affected by deforestation. But what about other types of forest fragmentation? For example, in the Panama Canal with the flooding, would the loss of forest in that way have a different effect on the local and regional impacts on temperature and precipitation compared to forest fragmentation from deforestation?
In Panama, particularly.
Yeah, so how the tropical forest was fragmented through the flooding, and then the island separated because of the flooding. So yeah, that kind of other type of forest fragmentation, would that have a different impact on the temperature and the precipitation?
Yeah, so I think, I guess the answer to that you would think would be, particularly for precipitation, that places like Panama, where you're much closer to the ocean's source of moisture, then you'd have the forest would have less impact on precipitation than right in the center of the Amazon, where you're thousands of kilometers from the nearest ocean. And that's also what's been thought for Southeast Asia, for the islands of Southeast Asia. They're much more maritime, much closer to the ocean. So you think that the deforestation responses there should be less. So we haven't found that, though, in our work. We sort of see similar responses in we haven't looked at Panama, but similar responses in Southeast Asia to deforestation that you see in the Amazon. So I'm not quite sure we fully understand that yet.
So
but
would the impacts be more buffered, maybe?
So I think I think that's what you'd expect, and you'd expect, less importance of kind of forest-derived moisture in a place that's so close to the ocean, and so maybe in places like Panama it is going to be less important, particularly for precipitation. But we also thought that would be the case in Southeast Asia, where we haven't really seen that. So yeah, I don't really know the answer.
Thanks. A lot of your analyses centered on Brazil. What's the sort of awareness of these issues in Brazilian sort of society? Do people must be aware it's getting hotter and drier?
I know we've got some Brazilians in the audience, so maybe they're better at answering this question than me. I mean, I think the kind of the public perception of aerial rivers is something that has, I think, started to gain, understanding in kind of public perception, and that kind of does describe really what, partly what we're seeing here, that there's rivers of moisture that are kind of flowing across the atmosphere and taking that moisture through the atmosphere and transporting to other places. It's maybe a massive simplification, and maybe people don't like it as a concept, but I think it has started as a simple way to explain to people what's happening. It maybe is quite useful, and does seem to, you see that in newspaper articles, and you see it in the kind of popular press. So I'd be open to discussion. Do people like that as a concept or not? You see some people like looking a bit, maybe it's too simple, I don't know. But I think going right back to the start, I think people living near tropical forests definitely do, appreciate and recognize some of these benefits. I think that gets lost maybe when you start to talk to, regional policymakers, when you talk to kind of agribusiness, when you talk to national policymakers. I think there's much less understanding of the benefits that forests bring, or the impacts that deforestation brings. And that's hopefully what some of this work is trying to do, is by maybe describing those local benefits, then gives, stronger evidence for those kind of local to regional policymakers to defend kind of forest protection policies.
Thank you. So do you think that this phenomena can also explain the climate change, at least in part, and that maybe like using data of the past, so how has been the deforestation in the past year, and compared to like climatological change, can explain or at least give an explanation to climate change, in order to say, okay, it's not just pollution, but it's also what we did with the forest that's these impacts that we see now?
Yes, I think particularly in tropical regions where the warming signal from tropical forests is strong, that is definitely stronger than you see in temperate forests. I think that tropical deforestation is causing part of the signal that we're seeing of the warming signal that we're seeing in the tropics. But I think that's additional to what we're seeing from global climate change. So these are kind of acting together in some regions. What does that mean? I mean, I guess at a local scale, you can kind of control your land use change. So you can control that warming that's happening due to local deforestation. You have less control on global climate change, obviously. So you can kind of control part of the signal. You could, you could reduce part of that warming that's going to happen in the future by controlling local deforestation. It's harder to control that global climate change signal, but yeah, both of them are acting together here. I don't know if that answered your question.
Yes, I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think, nothing I've said here is trying to say that, global warming isn't happening at a global scale as well. This is kind of part of the signal and additional to what we're kind of normally thinking of in terms of global climate change.
But my question was more on the past. So if we know, like what has changed in the last 20 years, like in the forest, like how much forest can be destroyed, how this like has impact already. I don't know if we have data about that. I mean, so we have forecasts for the future, but I mean,
Yeah. I mean, I think not everywhere, but in in parts of the Amazon, for example, deforestation really started happening in the 70s and 80s. So before that, there wasn't much widespread deforestation in the Amazon. Also in parts of Borneo, the forest was pretty intact till the 80s and 90s. So, people that started their career in the 1990s remember going to Borneo and it being completely intact forest, and that's changed in 20 to 30 years. So I think it's that big large scale tropical deforestation is a relatively new thing in many places within the last 40 to 50 years. So it doesn't really explain anything that was happening before maybe the 1980s or so.
That's time for one last question.
Yes. Okay. You started with a paper from 1888, and this is all focused on the Amazon, but I'm aware that the Mata Atlantica was pretty extensive in 1888, and I'm just wondering whether there's any meteorological data historically for Brazil that might show the effect of the loss of Mata Atlantica.
That's a good question, and that's definitely
Huge area.
a good example of a place where tropical deforestation started a lot earlier than the. We haven't looked at that, and I'm not aware of that evidence. So, but could be if the records were good enough, could be a good place to look at. I guess it's we're talking about a sort of 10 to 15% impact on rainfall, so it could be quite a hard signal to kind of pull out that historical data, maybe given variability in climate change and things like that. But it would be an interesting analysis to do, I think.
Okay, any other pressing question before we finish? Oh, two pressing questions. Okay, shall we go for quick ones? I'll go just here and then I'll move on in there.
Hi, thanks for the talk. I was wondering, in terms of the effects, if there were any that can be seen. Maybe this is more of a global scale question, but in terms of ENSO, El Nino, La Nina events, and how deforestation can actually impact that, if there is an impact, and what that would be.
Yeah, so we're collaborating on a project that's looking at some of these effects in ENSO and La Nina, and looking at which strong, and that's kind of early stage work, but it is important because these effects are kind of different in different periods. So kind of too early to kind of give you an answer on that, but it's an important question. Yes.
How well do we understand, how well do the models that we're looking at parameterize the differences in evapotranspiration between trees with different kinds of traits? So maybe more sort of like dry adapted ones versus wet adapted ones, and what effect would you expect that to have on the sort of overall picture?
So I think that is the sort of complexity that isn't yet really in climate models. So, a lot of the climate models will treat the massive complexity of vegetation in a very simplistic way. All the tropical forests will be treated with the same kind of plant functional type, and so you're taking that massive suite of complexity of hundreds or thousands of tree species and kind of smooshing it into kind of one variable. So that is a big place where I think we can make more progress of kind of better representation of that complexity. And I think people are working on that, but it's still at the moment probably a bit embarrassingly simple.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dominick.
Thank you.
And we will be in the diversity group with some drinks if you want to join, speaker.